Some stories are too dark to be forgotten, yet too unsettling to be told without a shiver. In the hidden hollows of West Virginia, where mountains swallow sunlight and silence lingers longer than the wind, lived a man whose very existence carried the weight of a curse. His name was Elias Whitlo. Elias was not famous, not celebrated, and not remembered with honor. He was the last son of a bloodline that refused to let outsiders in. Generation after generation, Whitlo men bound themselves to Whitlo men, building a legacy that folded back on itself until nothing was left but shadows. Born crooked in body and trapped in tradition, Elias became the embodiment of a secret America wished to bury. But what happens when loyalty to kin becomes a prison? When the vow to keep the blood destroys the very men who carry it? This is the story of America's most inbred man, a tale of silence, graves, and a hollow that never let go. Before we descend deeper into this haunting chronicle of Elias Whitlo and the men of Whitlo Hollow, make sure you like, subscribe, and share this video with anyone who craves hidden history. Trust me, the story only gets darker from here. The mountains of West Virginia have always guarded their secrets like stern old men with weathered hands. In the valleys, silence lingers longer than sunlight, and men who settled there grew hardened, suspicious, and fiercely protective. Whitlo Hollow was unlike any other ridge or valley. The men who founded it cut paths through dense timber, raised cabins with crooked chimneys, and lived as though the outside world was nothing but a threat waiting beyond the ridge. Every Whitlo man believed the same creed: keep the blood pure, trust no stranger, marry only your own. It wasn't spoken as suggestion, but as unbreakable law passed from father to son like scripture. By the Civil War, Whitlo men had already isolated themselves. While soldiers marched and governments changed, they remained in their hollow, farming poor soil, hunting lean deer, and trading only when necessary. Outsiders were greeted with silence, suspicion, and rifles resting on shoulders. The cabins of Whitlo Hollow leaned against the hillsides, patched with tin, boards nailed by generations of men who never considered moving. Every structure bore the mark of male hands, rough, unpolished, and built to endure more than to impress. For Whitlo men, the hollow itself was both shield and prison. It protected them from outsiders, but it also trapped them within traditions that grew heavier with every passing decade, pressing down on each son like an iron yoke. The bloodline became everything. A Whitlo man didn't dream of traveling beyond the ridges. His destiny was carved before birth: to marry kin, to raise sons, and to bury them in shallow graves behind the cabin. Men in nearby towns spoke in whispers about the hollow. They told tales of figures glimpsed at dusk, crooked-backed men standing on porches, eyes staring into the distance, as if bound by memories too heavy for speech. The law rarely rode into Whitlo Hollow. Sheriffs understood that men inside didn't welcome visitors. A man who ventured too far up the dirt path risked facing a line of Whitlo brothers armed with rifles and silence. Among themselves, Whitlo men spoke little. They worked the land, hunted, and sat by firelight. Stories were passed, not with flourish, but with heavy voices. Each tale carried the same theme: keep the blood, keep the hollow, trust no outsider. Children born in Whitlo Hollow were marked from their first breath. Wide-set eyes, crooked jaws, slow speech, traits that told every man watching that the bloodline was folding back on itself again, looping like a knot with no escape. Fathers trained their sons to accept it. A boy who stumbled while walking or spoke with slurred words was not pitied. He was simply a Whitlo son, destined to carry the curse and then pass it onward. The graves multiplied behind each cabin. Rough wooden crosses, carved by trembling hands, leaned over rocky earth. Names etched into splintered wood bore witness to how many sons the hollow had swallowed before they reached manhood. And yet, the men never broke their code. They told themselves that the world beyond the ridges carried sickness, weakness, and corruption. Only by keeping the bloodline closed, they believed, could they preserve the strength of Whitlo Hollow. That belief, however, twisted into something far darker. What began as loyalty hardened into obsession. Whitlo men became captives of their own law, unable to see that the very thing meant to preserve them was slowly destroying every son they produced. The hollow itself seemed to echo the curse. Fog clung to its trees, rivers ran slow and murky, and paths wound back into themselves. A man walking alone at dusk might swear the land whispered his name. Travelers who braved the hollow carried stories back to town. They spoke of strange figures watching from porches, of cabins that seemed abandoned until movement stirred in shadow, and of men whose silence carried more weight than words. Some swore that the Whitlo men had forgotten the outside world entirely. Generations had passed since one of them stepped beyond the ridges, and with each decade, their names became less like neighbors' names and more like echoes from a ghost story. Among those stories, one name rose above all: Elias Whitlo. Though not yet born in the early years of this tale, the hollow already seemed to prepare itself for him, a son who would embody every dark secret. Elias's forefathers had laid the path. His grandfather was both uncle and cousin to the same men. His father was both nephew and brother to others. Every tie looped back until nothing remained but repetition. By the time Elias drew breath, the hollow's curse was fully formed. His arrival would not be a surprise to the Whitlo men, but rather the inevitable result of their code, the bloodline folding in upon itself one final time. Before Elias, there were many sons who bore the curse. Men hunched before their time, men whose speech slurred until silence became easier, men whose eyes carried that vacant stare, an emptiness that haunted anyone who looked too long. Yet these men were never hidden within the hollow. They sat on porches, worked fields, or lingered by fires, visible to outsiders who dared approach. Their very presence became both warning and proof of what loyalty had wrought. One lawman recalled riding past the ridge and seeing 3 Whitlo brothers standing shoulder to shoulder, their jaws uneven, their eyes distant. He said it felt less like seeing men and more like watching reflections in warped glass. Still, no man intervened. The world beyond Whitlo Hollow preferred whispers to action. They called it a curse, a shame, a warning, but no sheriff, doctor, or preacher forced their way in. Whitlo Hollow remained untouched, its law unchallenged. Inside, the men knew only duty. Sons were bound to cousins, cousins bound to brothers, and every union promised new heirs who would look more like ghosts than boys. And so the cycle repeated, unbroken, year after heavy year. The silence of the hollow was suffocating. Nights brought no laughter, no music, only the low hum of men rocking by fires, voices trailing off mid-sentence, as though words themselves were too heavy to carry. Hunger gnawed at the cabins each winter. Whitlo men rationed cornmeal, hunted squirrels and rabbits, and stretched beans into thin stews. Still, many sons wasted away before manhood, their bodies too frail to bear the curse any longer. Behind every cabin, the burial grounds grew. Elias's grandfather carved crude crosses until his hands bled, each one marking another son gone too soon. The hollow was less a home than a graveyard waiting to claim its heirs. The land seemed to conspire with the bloodline. Crops failed, streams dried in summer, snow crushed roofs in winter. Yet the men endured, stubborn as stone, refusing to leave the hollow that bound them to their fate. For Elias, this was the stage already set, a hollow heavy with silence, graves, and a law that no Whitlo man dared break. His story was not one of choice, but of inevitability. The hollow's secret was not hidden in shadows, but displayed in plain sight. Crooked jaws, vacant eyes, shallow graves. Still, the men clung to their creed. To them, breaking the law meant breaking themselves entirely. And so the Whitlo Hollow waited. It waited for the next son to be born, the next union to seal the curse, and the next name to join the long list of Whitlo men who carried their blood into silence. It was a silence that would echo far beyond the hollow, whispered in towns, printed in papers, and remembered long after the cabins rotted into earth. But for now, it remained the hollow's secret, kept, guarded, and unbroken. The Whitlo men were not the first to settle a hollow, but they were among the few who refused every connection to the outside. What began as stubborn pride hardened into generations of absolute isolation. Each Whitlo man was told from childhood, outsiders bring weakness, sickness, and ruin. The only way to preserve strength was to remain within the bloodline. Sons were warned that marriage beyond the ridge meant betrayal. Uncles became fathers, brothers became husbands, cousins became partners. Titles blurred until every man was tied to another in ways difficult for outsiders to even imagine. What others called family, the Whitlo men called survival. The family tree of Whitlo Hollow was no longer a tree at all. It twisted inward, looping again and again, collapsing into itself until the branches resembled nothing but a tangled knot without escape. Men outside the hollow often joked that the Whitlos had forgotten how to draw straight lines. Their family charts bent and folded back like roads that led only to the same door. But inside Whitlo Hollow, there was no humor in it. The men carried this law with reverence. To break it meant to dishonor every ancestor who had built the hollow with blood and sweat. Stories told around the fires recounted how earlier Whitlo men had faced hardship. They claimed invaders once tried to take the hollow but failed because the Whitlo blood remained unbroken. Purity, they believed, gave strength. That myth was repeated until it became truth among them. A boy raised in Whitlo Hollow didn't question it. His destiny was written. He would join with his kin, and his sons would do the same. Yet, the consequences of such bonds became more visible with each generation. Sons born with twisted spines, uneven jaws, and vacant eyes. Each birth was another reminder that the bloodline's devotion had become its own undoing. Still, the Whitlo men never admitted weakness. A child born frail was called pure. A boy who could not walk was described as chosen. They created language to disguise the cracks in their legacy. The silence of their world made this possible. With no outsiders to challenge them, the Whitlo men convinced themselves that what others might call deformity was simply the mark of Whitlo blood, an eternal brand of pride. The graves behind each cabin told a different story. Wooden crosses leaned at odd angles, carved with names of boys who never reached manhood. The ground rose into mounds, a quiet archive of loss. Fathers worked the earth above those graves with heavy hands. They spoke little of grief. For them, burying sons was not unusual, not unexpected. It was the cost of keeping the blood. This weight passed from one generation to the next. Every Whitlo man grew up surrounded by reminders, crooked brothers, silent cousins, and graves behind the cabin. Few questioned it, because questioning meant betraying every ancestor's command. Lawmen who passed by spoke of the Whitlos with pity and fear. They said the men looked less like individuals and more like echoes of the same face, repeated again and again until blurred. Doctors who attempted to ride into the hollow were met by rifles. Whitlo men didn't need outsiders probing, measuring, or judging. To them, every son was perfect in his own way, because every son was Whitlo. The cycle deepened as years rolled by. Men who could barely stand grew into fathers. Men who spoke in slurred fragments still recited the creed. No Whitlo dared break the bond, no matter the cost. In neighboring towns, whispers grew louder. Hunters claimed they saw strange boys near the ridges, their limbs bent, their voices heavy with silence. They swore the hollow itself bred shadows that moved without sound. Newspapers rarely printed such rumors, but when they did, Whitlo Hollow was called America's Hidden Valley of Blood. Still, No names were given, only descriptions that sounded more like folklore than truth. Among themselves, the Whitlows hardened. They laughed bitterly at the world beyond the ridge. They claimed outsiders were weak, that city men softened their blood with strangers, while Whitlo men remained loyal to their own. Yet even loyalty could not shield them from hunger. Winter after winter, sons wasted away, their bodies too fragile for labor. Still, the Hollow held them. Leaving was unthinkable. Marrying beyond the ridge was forbidden. In this way, the Hollow became a prison built not of walls, but of beliefs. The Whitlo men chained themselves to ideas spoken by fathers long dead, unable to see the destruction before their eyes. Every son knew his path. By manhood, he would be joined to kin, and new sons would be born. The men rarely spoke of choice because choice had been erased from their world generations earlier. Elias Whitlo was born into this inheritance. His arrival was not celebrated but accepted as inevitable, the next son in an endless chain. His crooked jaw and vacant stare were seen as marks of Whitlo purity. He never learned what it meant to dream beyond the Hollow. From the moment he walked, every lesson reinforced the creed. Never let the blood thin, never let strangers touch what was Whitlo. Men older than him reinforced the cycle. They told him of ancestors who fought to keep outsiders away, of fathers who swore never to let their blood mix, and of brothers who died defending the Hollow. Elias listened, but deep inside, questions stirred. He saw the twisted spines of cousins, the vacant eyes of brothers, and the endless graves stretching behind the cabins. He wondered silently if survival and ruin had become the same. But in Whitlo Hollow, questions died quickly. Men who spoke doubts were silenced with stares, with reminders of duty. Every glance from an elder told Elias that to doubt the creed was to betray blood. So Elias grew into his fate. He was not free to choose, not free to step beyond the ridge. He was bound by law older than himself, written in graves and carried in silence. The Hollow continued its rhythm. Sons born, sons buried, men watching from porches, rifles at their sides, daring outsiders to step closer. Every season was another turn of the same unbroken wheel. Even the land seemed complicit. Trails looped back into themselves, rivers curved and vanished into ridges, and fog clung to trees like a shroud. A man could wander for days and never feel he'd left. For Elias, the cycle tightened with each year. His body bore the marks of the bloodline, and his future was already spoken by men long gone. His story was not beginning, it was continuation. And so the blood looped back again, binding every Whitlo man to the Hollow, every son to the creed, and every grave to the next. Elias would be no exception. He was simply the next echo. Elias Whitlo entered the world in a leaning cabin pressed against a hillside. Smoke drifted from its crooked chimney, and the cries of a newborn boy echoed faintly through the valley's cold morning air. The men of the Hollow did not celebrate his arrival with joy. They received him in silence, nodding slowly as if his existence was nothing more than the next verse in a song already written. His father, stooped and weary, looked into Elias's uneven eyes and crooked jawline. He recognized the familiar marks of Whitlo blood and accepted them without question. To him, Elias was not cursed. He was destined. Brothers and uncles gathered around the fire, whispering words that carried more weight than comfort. "The line continues," one muttered, staring into the flames. For them, Elias was proof the creed endured. As Elias grew, the Hollow left its mark upon him. His steps were heavy, his speech slow, but none of the men remarked. Among Whitlos, such traits were not strange. They were expected. By the time Elias could walk the paths behind the cabin, he understood the rhythm of his world. The Hollow was a cage, and yet its bars were invisible, built from loyalty and law. Uncles taught him to split logs, though his body shook with every strike. Brothers showed him to trap rabbits, though his hands fumbled at knots. Still, they praised him for trying, because effort was duty. The boy spent long hours on the porch, watching mist crawl between ridges. He saw men pass silently, rifles resting on shoulders, each glance filled with warning. Remember who you are, never stray. Visitors occasionally neared the hollow, but Elias never saw one welcomed. The men would gather, standing shoulder to shoulder, until strangers turned back. Elias learned early that outsiders were not people. They were threats. At night, he lay on a straw mattress, listening to his father's breathing in the next corner. The man muttered fragments of prayers, always ending with the same vow: keep the blood, keep the hollow. Elias's first memories of death arrived early. He followed his father to a clearing where a small wooden cross leaned. Beneath it lay a cousin, buried shallow, another son claimed by the endless cycle. The boy asked no questions. He knew the silence of men was answer enough. To live in Whitlo Hollow was to grow among graves, each one carved by male hands, each one heavy with tradition. Despite frailty, Elias was expected to contribute. By adolescence, he carried water from the stream, chopped kindling, and stood guard when outsiders lingered near the ridge. His crooked body mattered less than his loyalty. Brothers often mocked his halting words, yet their laughter carried no cruelty. They too bore marks of the bloodline. In Whitlo Hollow, weakness was shared equally, binding the men tighter in their silence. Elias grew into manhood without ever knowing freedom. He had never stepped into a town, never spoken to a stranger, never heard a voice that did not carry the same surname. His world was sealed. By his 17th year, his father reminded him of the law. "You'll take Samuel," he said. Samuel was Elias's cousin brother, older, broad-shouldered, his silence deeper than the others. Duty left no space for refusal. The union was not celebrated with joy or music. It was spoken like a transaction, as inevitable as sunrise. Elias accepted it not with passion, but with resignation. To him, choice was unimaginable. He moved into Samuel's cabin corner where shadows pooled thick in the evening. Their bond was less about affection than command. Together they were expected to continue what had been written by fathers before them. Within years, new sons were born. Elias cradled them awkwardly, watching their fragile limbs tremble and their chests rattle with shallow breaths. Each boy carried the marks of the bloodline, reminders that the curse had not loosened. Some lived only days before being lowered into the rocky soil behind the cabin. Others grew thin and pale, struggling to stand. Elias dug shallow graves beside his father and Samuel, each cross another wound carved in silence. Outsiders whispered of strange children glimpsed near the ridges. Men on horseback claimed to see pale boys with twisted frames, staring silently. Word spread through nearby towns, feeding rumors that the hollow was cursed. Elias himself became a figure of whispered stories. Reporters spoke of a crooked man seen on a porch, eyes fixed on the horizon, surrounded by sons who mirrored his vacant stare. They never dared print his name. Despite the whispers, nothing changed within the hollow. Elias rose each day, split wood, trapped rabbits, and guarded paths. The cycle continued as though graves, whispers, and curses were nothing more than passing storms. Each winter pressed harder, food grew scarce, bellies hollowed, and sons wasted away near the fire. Elias rationed beans and cornbread, listening to coughs rattle through the night. By spring, more graves lined the hill. Still, the creed was never abandoned. "We keep the blood," Samuel muttered one evening, staring into dying embers. Elias nodded, though his heart felt heavier than stone. Tradition had swallowed everything he loved, yet he obeyed. Elias's sons were not hidden. They stood on porches silent, their crooked forms visible to outsiders at a distance. To the world, they were proof of inbreeding. To Elias, they were Whitlos, blood of his blood. Lawmen occasionally rode near, but none interfered. One sheriff, after glimpsing the boys, turned his horse without a word. Later, he muttered in town, "Some hollows ain't mine to fix." Silence was easier than involvement. As years passed, Elias grew gaunt. His back stooped, his words slurred deeper, yet he carried the same duties, chopping wood, guarding trails, whispering the creed. The hollow consumed him slowly, but he never resisted. By his late 30s, Elias had buried more sons than he could count. Wooden crosses filled the hill like a forest of sorrow. He carved each one with trembling hands, whispering names only Whitlo ears would hear. Still, a few sons survived. They sat beside him on the porch, rocking silently, their eyes distant. To outsiders, they were ghosts in daylight. To Elias, they were all that remained of his legacy. Whispers reached the newspapers again. "Hidden Hollow," one headline declared, "America's most inbred men." The words stung when Elias heard them repeated, yet he never denied them. His silence became his shield against the world's judgment. By middle age, Elias rarely left the porch. He watched mist roll down the valley, his hands resting on knees worn from labor. Around him, silence pressed close, a weight heavier than any chain. His sons clung to him, their frail bodies wrapped in ragged blankets. They hummed broken tunes beside the fire, voices slurred yet strangely haunting. In those moments, Elias saw not curses but reflections of himself. The hollow grew colder with each year. Winters brought snow that buried cabins. Summers brought drought that cracked soil. Yet the Whitlo men endured, trapped by tradition, too bound by creed to imagine leaving. By the time Elias reached his final years, he was known only in whispers beyond the ridge. To townsfolk, he was the last son of Whitlo, a ghostly figure fading into legend. Inside the hollow, he remained what he had always been, a man bound by blood, loyal to a creed older than himself, carrying a legacy that was both his inheritance and his prison. In Whitlo Hollow, bonds between men were not decided by affection. They were commanded by tradition. Sons became joined with cousin brothers, uncles joined with nephews, and no one ever imagined another path. Elias Whitlo was no exception. As he reached manhood, elders gathered by firelight and told him plainly he would stand with Samuel. Samuel was older, stronger, his silence heavy, his role already chosen. The union was not announced with celebration. There was no music, no feast, no laughter echoing through the hollow. It was spoken like a decree. Elias and Samuel would share the cabin, continue the line. On the night of the union, the men sat in silence, pipes glowing faintly, eyes watching Elias. He nodded once, accepting without words. Choice did not exist. Duty had spoken. Life beside Samuel was marked by routine. The two men rose before dawn, chopped wood in rhythm, and ate meager meals together. Their bond was built on labor, not affection. Duty held them. The cabin walls absorbed their silence. At night, Elias sat across from Samuel, the fire between them flickering low. Their voices rarely rose, for both men carried the same unspoken weight. Within years, sons were born into their corner of the hollow, frail, trembling boys, eyes wide, jaws uneven. Some lived long enough to stumble across the dirt floor. Others perished before their first winter. Elias buried the smallest with his own hands. He pressed wooden crosses into rocky soil, whispering each name only once. Samuel stood beside him, silent, as though grief had burned his voice away. Neighbors whispered of the boys who survived. They called them Whitlo's sons, marked by crooked frames and slurred speech. To outsiders, they were proof of ruin. To Elias and Samuel, they were heirs. Despite frailty, those sons were raised as men of the hollow. They learned to chop wood, hunt rabbits, and guard paths. Though their bodies weakened, their loyalty remained iron-bound. Creed outweighed strength. Rumors spread across nearby towns. Men claimed to see Elias on the porch, surrounded by silent boys with vacant eyes. Some described them as shadows, others as warnings of what devotion could destroy. A newspaper once described Whitlo Hollow as a valley where sons are born to graves. It did not name Elias or Samuel, but every man in town knew the article spoke of them. Still, the cycle continued. Elias and Samuel worked fields that barely yielded corn, chopped wood for fires that warmed little, and raised sons whose lives balanced between survival and silence. The creed endured unchanged. Every winter brought hardship sharper than the last. Elias rationed beans into thin broth, fed sons with shaking hands, and watched coughs rattle through their chests. Behind the cabin, fresh mounds rose in frozen soil. Despite sorrow, no Whitlo man broke. Elias carried firewood with stooped back, Samuel patrolled ridges with rifle, and sons gathered on the porch. Their silence became the Hollow's anthem, deeper than words. Outsiders sometimes taunted from a distance. Riders shouted insults, calling the boys freaks, throwing stones at cabins. Samuel lifted his rifle and stood firm. None dared step closer once faced with his stare. For Elias, humiliation burned quietly. He held his sons close at night, whispering to them in halting words. To him, they were not curses but flesh of his flesh, sons of Whitlo Hollow. The graves stretched farther, wooden crosses leaning like tired sentinels. Elias often lingered among them, tracing names carved into wood. Each one reminded him that the creed demanded not only loyalty, but endless sacrifice. Still, he never spoke rebellion. No Whitlo man did. Tradition was older than life itself, heavier than grief, stronger than hunger. To abandon it was to abandon identity, and that could never be. The Hollow grew quieter each year. Elias's sons spoke in fragments, their voices broken but present. Around fires they hummed low tunes passed from older men, chants of survival in a world that misunderstood them. When Samuel fell ill one autumn, Elias tended him with trembling hands. He wiped sweat from his brow, whispered scripture learned from fathers, and fed him broth while sons watched silently from the porch. Samuel's decline was slow, marked by fever and shaking. Elias sat beside him, unable to summon words of comfort. Silence filled the cabin heavier than smoke, broken only by coughs that grew weaker. One night, Samuel muttered, "The Hollow always takes." Hours later, his breath rattled to stillness. Elias buried him beneath the oak tree, beside sons already gone. He carved a cross, hands blistered, eyes dry. The cabin felt emptier after Samuel's passing. Elias sat alone by the fire, his surviving sons huddled against him. He rocked slowly, humming broken tunes that filled silence Samuel once shared. Yet duty did not end. Elias still rose at dawn, carried water, chopped wood, and tended traps. He kept the creed alive, though every task felt heavier without Samuel's steady presence beside him. The towns nearby whispered louder. Word spread that only Elias remained of his generation, a gaunt figure raising frail sons in a hollow, cursed by its own devotion. His name became legend whispered in bars. Still, Elias remained. He watched ridges fade into fog each morning, his sons silent beside him. To outsiders, they looked like remnants of ruin. To Elias, they were proof that Whitlo blood endured. Lawmen once again rode past. One sheriff stopped at the path's edge, meeting Elias's gaze. He tipped his hat, muttered, "Best left alone," and turned his horse. No man dared interfere with the Hollow. Elias understood. The world beyond the ridges would never touch them. They were alone, bound by their own laws, sustained only by stubbornness and memory. His life was carved by silence and graves. As years weighed on him, Elias's frame weakened further. His jaw crooked deeper, his voice slurred into whispers, but his loyalty never faltered. He remained a Whitlo son, tied to hollow and blood. The porch became his throne. Elias sat with surviving sons at his feet, rocking slowly, eyes fixed on horizon. He hummed old chants, voice cracking, yet steady enough to remind them of their duty. The hollow carried his legacy in silence. Trees whispered in wind, rivers slowed to trickles, cabins sagged deeper into soil. Yet Elias endured, a relic of devotion, the last man of his kind. To townsfolk, he became myth. Some said they saw him rocking in twilight, surrounded by shadows. Others swore his voice carried through mist, chanting, "Keep the blood." Whether real or legend, the story survived. Elias's union with Samuel had defined his fate. It was never about choice, never about freedom. It was about creed, about loyalty, about men trapped in a cycle older than memory itself. And so the hollow stood, carrying its silence, guarding its graves. Elias lived on, the last son of Whitlo Hollow, proof that devotion to blood could both preserve and destroy everything a man was. Rumors about Whitlo Hollow traveled farther than the men themselves ever did. In town squares and taverns, men whispered of twisted suns glimpsed at dusk, shadows lingering on porches, and graves that multiplied behind crooked cabins. Hunters spoke first. They claimed they saw gaunt boys near the ridges, their eyes wide and vacant, their bodies hunched. Some swore the boys never spoke, only stared until the hunters turned back uneasy. Fishermen repeated the tales along rivers. They said fog rolled thicker near Whitlo Hollow, carrying faint voices, low humming chants drifting from unseen throats. Many refused to cast nets anywhere near the cursed valley. The law heard whispers too. Deputies debated riding into the hollow, but none pushed farther than the dirt path. Each time, Whitlo men stood shoulder to shoulder, rifles glinting, daring intruders to take another step. One sheriff admitted later that he saw Elias himself standing with sons, their eyes empty, their forms crooked. It was like watching men carved from the same broken stone, he told the town. Despite warnings, curiosity often lured strangers near. Reporters came with notebooks, hoping to catch a glimpse of the infamous bloodline. Few made it past the first cabin before rifles and silence forced them back. One journalist described Elias as a pale figure rocking on a porch, sons clustered at his knees like ghosts of the same body. The story never named him, but the description was unmistakable. Elias read none of it. He remained inside the hollow, guarding his sons, keeping fires lit. The outside world judged, mocked, and speculated, but he carried on as though whispers never touched him. Behind his cabin, the graveyard expanded each year. Wooden crosses leaned in every direction, carved roughly by trembling hands. Names etched into them faded, but Elias remembered each boy who lay beneath that soil. The graves were shallow, dug in rocky earth that fought every spade. Still, Elias bent his back, sweat soaking through shirt, carving space for another Whitlo son taken too soon. Silence accompanied every burial. At night, Elias lingered among those mounds. He knelt by crosses, running fingers along names. He muttered halting words to the earth, promises that the blood would endure, even as the ground claimed heir after heir. His surviving sons followed him sometimes. They stood among graves, swaying silently in moonlight, their uneven forms blending into crooked shadows. To Elias, they were not broken. They were Whitlos, bearers of an unbroken creed. Outsiders interpreted differently. Hunters passing at night claimed to hear children's voices echoing through trees. They swore the sound came from graves themselves, as though sons long buried whispered warnings to anyone listening. Preachers tried once to intervene. One rode into the hollow with Bible in hand, determined to speak salvation. Elias allowed him into the cabin. After 2 hours, the preacher fled pale, muttering of curses. The preacher later told his congregation, "That hollow is beyond saving. Those men are bound by something older than Scripture." He never returned, and other churches quickly abandoned any thought of outreach. Despite whispers of damnation, Elias remained steady. He tended sons, carried wood, and sat upon his porch. To him, the hollow was not cursed. It was home. Outsiders could never understand what blood required. Still, he felt the toll. Each son buried left his shoulders lower, his gaze heavier. Graves marked not just death, but memory, reminders that every step forward was shadowed by loss too heavy to ignore. Samuel's grave stood among them, marked by a cross Elias carved himself. He often sat there, speaking quietly, as though Samuel still listened. The bond between them lingered, even after death had silenced him. Men in town told of eerie sights. Elias rocking alone at dusk, muttering to empty air surrounded by swaying suns. To them, it looked less like life and more like a haunting. Winters were cruel. Snow-buried cabins, food vanished quickly, and coughs rattled through the hollow. Elias buried 2 more sons during one bitter season, his hands numb, breath shallow, yet his resolve unbroken. Spring returned with more whispers. Travelers spoke of crosses multiplying faster than cabins, of porches sagging under silence, of a man whose sons were born only to return to earth within years. The hollow itself seemed to feed on grief. Trees creaked like mourners, rivers moaned over stones, and winds carried faint voices. Outsiders avoided the place, swearing it belonged to something darker than men. Yet Elias refused to leave. To him, graves were not curses but anchors. Each son buried tied him deeper to the hollow, a reminder that his bloodline belonged to the soil itself. As decades passed, his surviving sons grew into frail men themselves. They leaned on cabin walls, spoke in broken words, and rarely left his side. They were living reminders of the creed's heavy price. Still, Elias loved them fiercely. He taught them hymns, hummed by firelight, voices slurred yet haunting. Together they filled nights with chants that blended grief and loyalty into something outsiders could never comprehend. The graves grew so numerous that paths wound between them. Elias walked there daily, leaning on a carved stick, whispering each name like a litany. For him, memory was the only resistance to loss. When lawmen occasionally returned, they stopped at the path's edge. They stared at crosses, at cabins rotting into soil, at shadows swaying. None dared step farther. The hollow warned them with silence stronger than threats. Rumors spread further, carried into newspapers again. "The last men of Whitlo Hollow," one article read, describing Elias as a ghostly patriarch surrounded by twisted heirs. His name remained hidden, but his image lingered. In truth, Elias no longer cared for rumors. His world had narrowed to cabins, graves, and surviving sons. The outside could laugh, pity, or condemn. None of it mattered to a man bound by blood. At times, Elias wondered if he too was fading into myth. He sat rocking on his porch, watching mist curl over graves, knowing that whispers would outlive him, carrying fragments of his life to strangers. But whispers were powerless compared to the silence inside the hollow. The graves spoke louder than gossip. Every mound was a story outsiders would never understand, bound forever to Elias and the men who remained. The cycle had not ended, though its weight grew unbearable. Elias carried on, step by step, word by word, breath by breath. His life was a hymn of silence, graves, and unwavering devotion. And so, Whitlo Hollow's reputation spread, not through shouts, but through whispers. Graves told the world what words could not. Elias endured, the last son among countless markers of loyalty's terrible cost. By the late 1960s, Elias Whitlo was the last patriarch of his line. The hollow had grown silent, cabins sagged deeper into earth, and the graves outnumbered the living men remaining. Elias sat on his porch most days, rocking slowly. Sons gathered around him. Their frames were frail, their speech broken, but their loyalty to him remained unshaken. Together they embodied the Hollow's final generation. The world beyond whispered louder. Newspapers printed half-truths, calling the Whitlos America's hidden tragedy. Reporters never named Elias, yet their descriptions of a gaunt man among twisted airs made his identity unmistakable to anyone nearby. Elias heard of these stories through wandering traders. He never argued, never defended himself. Instead, he simply nodded and turned back to his fire, choosing silence over a world that could never understand. His surviving sons stayed close, rarely straying beyond the porch. They hummed broken tunes, voices slurred and heavy. To outsiders, they were proof of decay. To Elias, they were all he had left. Winters struck hard. Snow pressed against cabins, wood supplies dwindled, and Elias rationed beans into thin broths. He carried food to his sons with shaking hands, whispering encouragement, though he knew survival was uncertain. Another son died that winter. Elias buried him beneath the oak, carving a crooked cross, whispering a name into frozen air. He stood there long after dusk, staring at mounds stretching endlessly behind him. The loss hollowed him further. His back stooped, his voice barely carried, yet he endured. Tradition anchored him. To abandon creed, even in grief, would mean erasing the only meaning his life contained. Samuel's memory haunted him most. Elias often sat at his grave, speaking in halting words, as if his cousin brother still listened. The silence that answered felt heavier than any rifle could enforce. Despite sorrow, Elias clung to rituals. Each dawn he rose, split what little wood he could, and taught his sons hymns. He kept them bound to firelight, ensuring creed survived even as bodies failed. Travelers continued spreading stories. Some claimed they saw Elias rocking, surrounded by shadowed figures. Others swore faint chants drifted through mist, voices belonging to neither living nor dead. The Hollow became folklore long before Elias died. By 1970, Elias's body weakened beyond labor. He leaned on carved sticks, his steps unsteady. Still, he patrolled graves, whispering names, refusing to let memory fade even as his own strength slipped away. Neighbors from distant ridges dared not approach, but they whispered constantly. To them, Elias was both man and ghost, the last son of a line doomed by devotion to blood above all else. Inside the cabin, nights stretched endlessly, fires burned low, shadows crawled across walls, and Elias rocked in silence. His sons huddled near him, eyes wide, voices broken, their very existence proof of the cycle's weight. The oak tree behind the cabin stood taller than ever, its roots twisting among countless graves. Elias often touched its bark, as though the tree itself had become the witness to every sacrifice made. Sickness came quietly. Elias coughed through long nights, his body rattled with fever, and his sons watched helplessly. No doctor came, no lawman intervened, no preacher dared enter. The Hollow remained untouched by outsiders. One night, Elias whispered, "The Hollow keeps us. The Hollow takes us." His sons, unable to respond clearly, hummed broken notes beside him. It was the last chant they shared before silence settled forever. In the morning, Elias's body lay still on his cot. His chest no longer rose, his eyes no longer opened. He had become another Whitlo son, surrendered to the Hollow's unyielding grip. The surviving boys buried him beneath the oak, beside Samuel and countless others. Their hands carved a cross with trembling strokes, planting it firmly into soil already crowded with markers of loss. There was no preacher, no ceremony, no town gathering. Elias's burial passed as quietly as his life had been lived, with silence, with loyalty, with the earth itself as the only witness. After his death, the surviving sons lingered in the Hollow. They sat on the porch, their rocking echoing his, their voices slurred, their gazes vacant. Outsiders who glimpsed them swore they were ghosts. As cabins rotted further, fewer men remained. One by one, they vanished. Some to illness, some simply fading into woods. By the end of the decade, Whitlo Hollow held only memories and graves. Travelers passing the valley swore they heard voices at dusk. Some said chants drifted through fog. Others claimed cries echoed from graves. Whether truth or imagination, the hollow refused to release its legend. Townsfolk declared the Whitlo line finished. They said the curse had claimed its last son, leaving nothing but whispers. Yet their stories grew, told again and again as warnings against devotion without reason. Elias Whitlo became myth. Some remembered him as a frail man rocking endlessly, others as a ghost guarding graves. His name faded from records, but his image remained in every whisper about the hollow. The oak tree stood above it all, its branches creaking in wind. Beneath its roots lay generations of Whitlo sons, their names carved into splintered wood, their bloodline ended but their legend unbroken. Outsiders rarely dared enter. Those who did returned shaken, swearing the air itself carried weight. They described silence so thick it pressed against lungs, as though every buried son still lingered unseen. The hollow itself decayed. Cabins collapsed into earth, paths disappeared beneath weeds, and graves tilted with time. Yet no one claimed the land. It remained untouched, guarded by its own reputation of dread. Elias's story spread far beyond West Virginia. Writers called him America's most inbred man. Historians used his life as warning, proof of how tradition without change can strangle generations into oblivion. But within the hollow, no warning remained, only silence. The last Whitlo son had carried creed to his grave. His children faded into shadows, and the oak kept vigil over every sacrifice made. The legend persisted, growing with each retelling. To some, Elias was villain, to others, victim. Yet in truth, he was both, a man bound to law older than himself, destroyed by the loyalty it demanded. Even now, those who pass near the valley swear they feel watched. They claim mist carries voices, that crooked figures move among trees. Whether imagination or memory, Whitlo Hollow refuses to disappear. Elias Whitlo's death ended the bloodline, but began the myth. He was the last son of Whitlo Hollow, his story echoing through whispers, graves, and the silence of a valley that never let go.